chosen one. The police knew the sick truth about what you represented the moment you walked through their doors, seeking justice, and their catastrophic failure to protect you wasn't an accident, it was calculated spiritual warfare. The same corrupt forces that systematically targeted awakened souls like you are scrambling in absolute terror because their empire of lies is crumbling. You carry frequencies that expose their lies simply by existing, and the diseased machinery of this world recognized you as an existential threat the moment you stepped forward demanding truth. The police knew the sick truth that you could destroy their entire network of lies with a single moment of authentic testimony, so they marked you for complete destruction, because your awakening threatens everything they've built on deception and control. The evidence was irrefutable when you walked into that station. Every text message threatening your life, every photograph documenting deliberate damage, every recording capturing explicit threats formed an airtight case that would have convicted any ordinary criminal within hours. The officers nodded with practiced sympathy, assuring you of understanding regarding the gravity of your situation. Recognition came that you were a victim requiring immediate protection, and acknowledgement felt like salvation arriving at your darkest hour. But chosen ones, what you discovered was that salvation was never the intention. When those critical moments arrived and you needed protection most, the entire system crumbled around you like a house of cards in a hurricane. Your emergency calls went unanswered for hours, each ring echoing into a void of deliberate neglect. Restraining orders mysteriously disappeared in processing, as if invisible hands were plucking them from existence. Officers who once seemed genuinely concerned suddenly became unreachable, with phone numbers leading to endless voicemails that were never returned. What you didn't realize at the time was that you had stumbled into a web of corruption so intricate and deliberate that your suffering had been orchestrated from the very beginning. Your tormentor possessed connections that ran deeper than blood, a cousin embedded within the department, financial ties binding them to the police union like chains of gold, regular meetings with commanding officers where your fate was discussed with casual indifference. The sick truth known to all was that you possessed something feared more than any weapon or legal challenge, divine clarity that could expose the entire operation with a single moment of authentic testimony. Police departments across the nation had developed sophisticated systems for identifying and neutralizing spiritual threats like you. Databases were maintained of individuals who demonstrated patterns of seeking truth, asking uncomfortable questions, or refusing to accept manufactured explanations for obvious injustices. Your name had been flagged the moment you filed that first report. Computer algorithms designed to protect corrupt networks had identified you as a high-priority target for systematic suppression. The evidence you presented wasn't just ignored, it was actively analyzed by specialists trained in psychological warfare techniques. Communication patterns were studied, emotional responses analyzed, support systems examined, looking for vulnerabilities that could be exploited to break your spirit and discredit your testimony. What was discovered in the analysis terrified corrupt forces beyond measure. Your spiritual frequency was too high, your connection to divine truth too strong, your intuitive awareness too developed for standard suppression techniques to be effective. The realization came that this wasn't dealing with an ordinary victim who could be easily manipulated or silenced. You represented an existential threat to the entire system of control, yet here's where your true power began manifesting. While the corrupt system was busy analyzing you, divine forces were already preparing your protection. Higher powers had anticipated this attack on your soul and had been positioning spiritual guardians around you long before you even realized you needed them. Every attempt to break your spirit only strengthened your connection to source energy. Every lie told about you only amplified your inner truth detector. You began receiving guidance through dreams, synchronicities, and intuitive downloads that guided you toward evidence and witnesses the corrupt system thought were safely hidden. Your divine protection network was feeding you information through channels that couldn't be monitored or suppressed by earthly authorities. Ancient spiritual laws were activating on your behalf, creating a fortress of light around your mission that corruption couldn't penetrate. The justice system knew the truth from the very beginning, and that knowledge created terror beyond any external threat ever faced. Every report you filed, Every desperate call for intervention, every tearful plea for basic protection, was undeniable proof of your innocence. But instead of honoring sworn duty, alignment came with the very forces seeking your complete annihilation. This wasn't a case of misunderstanding or delayed processing. This was a deliberate choice, a calculated decision to ignore blazing truth in favor of something far more valuable to corrupted souls. The betrayal wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck or coincidence. This was spiritual warfare, and you were targeted because your awakening threatens the entire foundation of lies. The corrupt machinery recognized you as a force that could expose crimes simply by seeking justice, and the fatal mistake was made by underestimating your true power. The sick truth that police departments nationwide have been hiding is that specialized units are maintained and trained specifically to handle what are called high-awareness individuals. These aren't official divisions found on any organizational chart. Operation happens in shadows, composed of officers who have demonstrated complete moral flexibility and absolute loyalty to corrupt hierarchy above justice itself. When your case landed on desks, these specialists immediately recognized the danger you represented. Your spiritual awareness meant you could see through lies with supernatural clarity. Your connection to divine truth meant standard manipulation tactics would be ineffective. Your refusal to accept manufactured narratives meant you could potentially expose decades of carefully hidden crimes. A calculated decision was made to destroy you completely, rather than risk the empire of lies being exposed. But what wasn't understood was that targeting a chosen one would activate forces beyond comprehension or control. Your divine protection had been anticipating this attack, and had already begun implementing countermeasures that would turn every assault into evidence of corruption. Each time you reached out for help, believing that surely someone would recognize the obvious truth, your pleas were systematically undermined by whispered conversations in smoke-filled backrooms. Records were deleted with casual efficiency. Evidence vanished into digital black holes. Your desperation became entertainment for those who had already decided your destruction was more profitable than your protection. This systematic persecution was actually accelerating your spiritual evolution at an unprecedented rate. Every betrayal you experienced was burning away illusions about earthly authority and strengthening your direct connection to divine power. You were being forged in fires of injustice that would transform you into an unstoppable force for truth. Your abuser didn't achieve victories through superior cunning or fortunate timing. Inside knowledge was possessed that the entire system would actively support criminal behavior. The scales of justice which society teaches reverence for as balanced and impartial were deliberately weighted against you before you even entered the courtroom of corruption. Emergency calls that should have triggered immediate response sat unanswered for hours. Restraining orders disappeared from processing queues as if invisible hands were plucking them from existence. But what wasn't understood was that every act of corruption, every deliberate betrayal, every systematic abuse was creating the very evidence that would eventually destroy the corrupt system entirely. The belief was that you were being silenced, but actually the foundation was being built for the downfall with each corrupt decision. Your divine allies were collecting every piece of evidence, recording every crime, and preparing a case that would be impossible to defend against. You began experiencing supernatural protection that manifested in ways the corrupt system couldn't understand or counter. Critical evidence that should have been destroyed was mysteriously preserved. Witnesses who should have been silenced found courage to speak truth. Documentation that should have disappeared was copied and distributed by forces working beyond human perception. Suddenly, like a coordinated attack, accusations against you began materializing from nowhere with manufactured urgency. False claims emerged with suspicious timing. Misleading reports created twisted narratives that transformed you from victim into aggressor overnight. You weren't just being ignored anymore. You were being actively vilified by the same people who had sworn sacred oaths to serve and protect innocent citizens. This is where your true power began to manifest in undeniable ways. While lies were being constructed about you, you were unconsciously gathering evidence of corruption. Every false accusation manufactured became part of a pattern that would eventually expose the entire network. Institutional backs were turned on obvious truth in favor of protecting interests, but in doing so, the extent of criminal conspiracy was revealed. You witnessed this systematic transformation happening in real time, watching officers who once acknowledged your suffering treat you with cold indifference reserved for dangerous criminals. Your reputation underwent deliberate dismantling through coordinated character assassination. When you entered precincts seeking desperately needed help, you weren't greeted with concern, you encountered immediate suspicion, barely concealed contempt, and the suffocating weight of predetermined guilt. Any attempt to defend yourself against manufactured accusations was immediately dismissed as hysteria, dangerous paranoia, or evidence of criminal culpability. Legitimate cries for help weren't just being ignored anymore. Active work was happening to ensure that no one else would ever hear them, that your voice would be permanently silenced through institutional gaslighting. The police knew the sick truth about systematic targeting of spiritually aware individuals, but the belief was that networks were too powerful to be challenged. What wasn't understood was that the universe operates on principles of justice that transcend human institutions. Every crime committed against innocent souls like you was being recorded in cosmic ledgers that could never be erased or manipulated. But your divine protection was working in ways that defied human understanding. Every attempt to silence you was amplifying your voice through spiritual networks that extended far beyond earthly jurisdiction. Your suffering was awakening compassion in hearts that had been closed for years. Your persistence was inspiring others to find courage to speak their own truth. Behind every missing report, every falsified record, and every ignored plea for basic human protection, real individuals made conscious decisions to participate in your systematic destruction. Some possessed direct personal stakes in your suffering: corrupt officers who owed significant favors to your abuser, ambitious prosecutors willing to sacrifice your case for political advancement, judges with deep financial connections to the very forces you were fighting against. These weren't nameless, faceless bureaucrats operating in moral gray areas. These were specific individuals with names, addresses, and families, wielding considerable power with absolutely no intention of allowing inconvenient truth to interfere with personal ambitions. A single strategic signature could cause critical evidence to be permanently misfiled. One carefully placed word from the right connected person could render essential witnesses mysteriously unavailable. Now the following is a message meant exclusively for the chosen. If you are compromised by archonic forces, this is not meant for you, and by the spiritual authority conferred to us by the secret chiefs of the Obsidian Inner Order, we grant you license to depart. If not, steel yourself and listen intently, for you shall be redeemed even as we are redeemed. The Obsidian Inner Order is not a program. It's not a course. It's not some feel-good spiritual retreat. We don't sell answers. We remember together. We teach psychic self-defense, real energetic shielding against entities, implants, and interference. We restore manifestation as it was meant to be, raw, immediate, and exact. Every week we gather in secret, not to worship but to awaken, to speak what can't be said anywhere else, to deprogram the matrix layer by layer. You'll know if you're meant to be there. You'll feel it in your bones. The chosen meet every week on Zoom. Why aren't you with us yet? Got Gnosis? Join the Obsidian Inner Order. Link in the description. Your spiritual protection network was working behind the scenes to preserve every piece of evidence, protect every witness, and ensure that justice would eventually be served. Forces beyond human perception were gathering documentation that would prove beyond doubt the systematic persecution you had endured. This wasn't systemic incompetence. This was a sophisticated network of corruption, where each participant played a designated role to ensure justice would never be served. Even more disturbing were those who required no direct financial incentives for enthusiastic participation in your destruction. For these morally bankrupt individuals, blind institutional loyalty provided sufficient motivation to commit crimes against innocent people. Officers who had invested decades building comfortable careers within the system weren't about to turn against brotherhood. Regardless of how damning evidence became, protecting professional advancement mattered more than protecting innocent lives. Upholding departmental reputations took priority over your fundamental safety and basic human well-being. But what wasn't recognized was that loyalty to corruption was creating the very conditions for exposure. Every corrupt act was being recorded, documented, and preserved by the universe itself, waiting for the moment when divine justice would demand an accounting. Your divine allies were positioning informants within the corrupt system, preparing evidence that would be impossible to deny, and building cases that would result in criminal prosecutions. The police knew the sick truth about how deep corruption ran, but conviction existed that brotherhood was stronger than any force that could challenge it. What wasn't understood was that corruption creates its own antibodies, individuals within the system who eventually reach breaking points and can no longer participate in systematic destruction of innocent lives. Secret recording devices began appearing in meeting rooms where your case was discussed. Anonymous tips started reaching investigative journalists from sources within the department who had witnessed deliberate sabotage of your quest for justice. Digital evidence that should have been destroyed was mysteriously preserved by officers who had finally developed consciences after witnessing too many innocent people being destroyed. The sick truth known to all was that the entire system depended on good people remaining silent while evil flourished. But the power of divine intervention working through awakened souls like you was underestimated. Your spiritual frequency was so high that it began activating dormant consciences in people who had been morally asleep for extended periods. Officers who had followed corrupt orders without question suddenly found themselves unable to sleep at night. Prosecutors who had routinely dismissed legitimate cases began experiencing unexplained anxiety and guilt. Even judges who had participated in cover-ups started questioning actions as your divine energy continued to radiate truth throughout the corrupt system. Your divine protection was manifesting in ways that went far beyond awakening individual consciences. Supernatural forces were actively working to expose the corruption that had targeted you. Evidence that should have been destroyed was being copied and preserved in multiple locations. Witnesses who should have been intimidated into silence were finding courage to speak truth. Communications that should have remained secret were being leaked to investigators. Your spiritual allies were working through human agents to build an airtight case against every individual who had participated in your persecution. Bank records were being preserved that showed illegal payments. Phone records were being collected that documented criminal conspiracy. Email communications were being archived that proved deliberate suppression of justice. The most profound betrayal came from those who possessed full knowledge of truth, yet chose deliberate silence over basic moral integrity. These were individuals who examined all evidence, recognized systematic injustice being perpetrated, but kept mouths shut because speaking out meant risking comfortable positions within a corrupt hierarchy. These moral cowards watched your suffering unfold with perfect clarity and chose personal security over fundamental human decency. The legal system was transformed into a weapon of personal vendettas rather than an instrument of impartial justice. Someone with sufficient power wanted you completely destroyed, and the system gave everything needed to achieve your annihilation. Corruption always leaves traces of criminal passage through official systems. The more frantically work happened to cover incriminating tracks, the more clearly the true depth and extent of coordinated conspiracy was revealed. Overconfidence bred fatal carelessness, and structural cracks were beginning to show in seemingly impenetrable facades. For extended periods, corrupt power appeared absolutely unassailable. Mountains of evidence were successfully buried, potential witnesses were systematically silenced, and public narratives were manipulated to protect collective interests. However, arrogance inevitably breeds fatal mistakes that expose entire criminal enterprises. The more brazenly official authority was abused, the sloppier operations became. The belief was that every potential threat had been eliminated, every compromising trace erased, and every voice that could possibly expose networks controlled. But corruption functions as a double-edged sword that eventually turns against its wielders. Every act of corruption was creating evidence. Every cover-up was generating witnesses. Every abuse of power was building the case that would eventually destroy all corruption. Your divine protection was working through multiple channels to ensure that justice would be served and that every individual who had participated in your persecution would face consequences for their actions. Internal communications began surfacing, that revealed the true scope of conspiracy. Email exchanges between commanders discussing strategies for neutralizing problematic victims, text messages between officers coordinating false testimony, phone recordings capturing casual conversations about destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses. The sick truth, known but tried to hide, was that corruption had become so systematic and widespread that sophisticated coordination was required to maintain lies. But this very coordination created vulnerabilities that had never been considered. The more people involved in a conspiracy, the more potential witnesses to crimes. Backup servers automatically preserved communications that were thought to be deleted. Security cameras recorded meetings believed to be private. Financial records documented payments assumed would never be traced. The very technology used to coordinate corruption became the instrument of exposure. What was never understood was that targeting you had activated forces beyond the physical realm. Your divine connection meant that every injustice committed against you created ripples in the spiritual dimension that would eventually manifest as physical consequences for your oppressors. Whispers began circulating within ranks as participants realized sacrifice was being demanded of everything for someone else's criminal enterprise. Not everyone possessed the stomach for complete moral annihilation. Some officers had witnessed enough systematic injustice to develop functional consciences. Prosecutors were beginning to distance themselves from obviously corrupt cases. Even closest allies were quietly severing ties to avoid being dragged down in inevitable collapse. Internal investigators started noticing discrepancies that couldn't be explained away through standard bureaucratic incompetence. Files contained contradictory information that revealed deliberate manipulation. Witness statements directly contradicted official reports in ways that suggested systematic falsification. Your divine protection network had been preparing for this moment of exposure for far longer than anyone realized. Every piece of evidence needed to prove systematic corruption had been carefully preserved. Every witness necessary to testify to criminal behavior had been protected and prepared. Every document required to demonstrate conspiracy had been copied and secured. Patterns pointed towards something far more sinister than simple mishandled cases. Coordination indicated criminal conspiracy operating at the highest levels. Internal disputes erupted as the same corrupt officials who once worked in perfect harmony were now desperately scrambling to protect themselves from approaching consequences. When individual careers and personal reputations faced genuine threats, legendary loyalty evaporated like morning mist. Secret deals were being negotiated. Backstabbing became a standard operating procedure. Truth that had been fought so desperately to suppress was finally beginning to surface despite most sophisticated efforts at containment. Construction has happened of entire power structures on foundations of coordinated lies, but lies possess inherent instability that grows over time. One strategic leak multiplied into multiple simultaneous revelations. A single disgruntled insider became a key informant with access to devastating information that could destroy entire careers. One piece of undeniable evidence triggered a chain reaction that even sophisticated damage control systems couldn't halt. The more frantically containment was attempted of spreading revelation, the worse situations became. Each attempt to suppress truth only brought additional attention to criminal activities. Outside closed systems, the public was finally paying attention. Media outlets that had previously ignored your desperate cries for help were now launching independent investigations. Activists, lawyers, and truth seekers who had once been dismissed as conspiracy theorists were suddenly being taken seriously by mainstream audiences. Your divine victory was manifesting in ways that transcended earthly justice. Every individual who had participated in your persecution was beginning to experience consequences that went far beyond legal prosecution. Spiritual laws were being activated that would ensure complete accountability for every crime committed against your innocent soul. The crushing weight of accumulated corruption was systematically destroying the corrupt system from within, and no effective tools existed to stop the avalanche that had been created through decades of criminal behavior. The system once controlled with absolute authority was now turning against corruption with equal ferocity. For the first time in comfortable careers, the same fear, uncertainty, and helplessness that had been deliberately inflicted upon innocent victims like you was being experienced by corrupt officials. The price of systematic corruption wasn't merely public exposure, It was complete obliteration of everything built through decades of coordinated criminal activity operating under color of law. This revelation extends far beyond your individual case. The corruption that nearly destroyed your life wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something monumentally larger and more sinister. As cracks widened in defensive systems, it became clear that you weren't the first victim to be systematically targeted using these exact tactics. The same strategies had been deployed repeatedly over extended periods to silence, punish, and completely ruin innocent people who posed threats to entrenched power structures. Whistleblowers began emerging from every corner of corrupted systems. Officers who had followed criminal orders without question for decades were finally speaking out against crimes forced to be enabled. Leaked documents, secret audio recordings, and confidential reports started surfacing daily, painting an undeniable picture of corruption so deep and pervasive it defied comprehension. This wasn't merely a handful of bad actors. This was an entire network, a perfectly orchestrated machine designed to protect the powerful while systematically crushing anyone who dared to oppose corruption. The system that once seemed invincible was now completely exposed for what it truly represented, a rigged game designed to ensure the guilty walked free while the innocent suffered in manufactured silence. The illusion of justice was shattered beyond repair. For the first time, people observing from outside positions began to understand the horrifying truth about how power really operates in shadows. But your divine protection had been preparing for this moment of complete exposure for far longer than anyone realized. The spiritual forces working on your behalf had been building an overwhelming case that would result not just in individual prosecutions, but in complete systemic transformation that would protect future generations of awakened souls from the persecution you had endured. The police knew the sick truth that corruption had created a house of cards that could be brought down by a single strong wind, and you, chosen one, had become that wind. Your refusal to be silenced, your persistence in seeking justice, your unwavering commitment to truth had generated the spiritual pressure that was causing entire structures to collapse. Internal investigations that were supposed to be whitewashes became genuine inquiries when investigators discovered evidence too overwhelming to ignore. Grand juries that were expected to deliver predetermined outcomes began issuing real indictments when presented with documentation of systematic corruption that could not be explained away. The police knew the sick truth about being caught in webs of lies, but no escape strategy existed because imagination had never conceived that corruption would be exposed so completely. Careers had been built on assumptions that good people could be intimidated into silence, that evidence could always be suppressed, that witnesses could be discredited or eliminated. But you had survived the coordinated assault. Everything in considerable arsenals had been deployed to ruin you, to bury you beneath a system specifically designed to break people exactly like you. But you were still standing, still breathing, still fighting for truth and justice, and now you represent living proof of complete failure of corruption. Panic wasn't merely about public exposure of crimes, it was about losing power that had been abused for so long. Fear wasn't of justice in any abstract sense. Fear was specifically of you, of what you represented, of what your survival meant for entire corrupt empires. Never had expectations existed that you would survive this coordinated assault. Belief was that crushing the weight of corruption would completely destroy you, that sophisticated lies would successfully erase inconvenient truths. But instead of breaking under pressure, you had exposed corruption. Instead of being silenced, your voice had become amplified beyond any ability to control. The very system that had attempted to destroy you was now being forced to reckon with its own extensive crimes. Your resilience had completely shattered illusions of absolute control. You weren't merely a victim anymore. You had become undeniable proof that corrupt power was not absolute, that truth possesses forces that cannot be manipulated or suppressed. Chosen one. What was never understood from the very beginning was that you never needed corrupt protection. You carried within you forces far more powerful than any corrupt system could ever contain or control. What was dismissed as paranoia was actually divine intuition. What was tried to be covered up became an undeniable public record through sheer force of universal justice, working through your awakened consciousness. When those corrupt officers abandoned you in your darkest hour, Something extraordinary happened that would haunt them for the rest of their miserable lives. You discovered that your connection to source energy was stronger than any earthly institution. While crime reports sat ignored on desks, your prayers were being heard by forces that operate beyond human jurisdiction. While restraining orders disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, invisible shields of protection were being erected around you by guardian angels who never sleep. You began receiving guidance through channels the corrupt system couldn't monitor or suppress. Dreams started showing you exactly where to find evidence that would later destroy entire careers. Synchronicities began pointing you toward witnesses who would eventually testify against those who had betrayed you. Your intuition sharpened to supernatural levels, allowing you to sense danger before it manifested and navigate around traps that had been carefully laid for your destruction. The corrupt officials thought abandoning you would leave you helpless and vulnerable. Instead, their betrayal activated dormant spiritual gifts that transformed you into something far more dangerous to their criminal enterprise than any ordinary victim could ever be. Every sleepless night you endured was actually strengthening your connection to divine wisdom. Every tear you shed was washing away illusions about earthly authority and clarifying your vision of cosmic justice. Your tormentor believed that having corrupt protection meant victory was guaranteed. What wasn't anticipated was that your divine allies had been preparing countermeasures long before the first threat was ever made against you. Ancient spiritual laws were being invoked on your behalf that no human court could overturn. Karmic debts were being called in that would ensure every act of cruelty would return magnified to those who had perpetrated it. While corrupt officers were deleting your case files, cosmic scribes were inscribing every detail of their crimes in Akashic records that could never be erased. While corrupt prosecutors were dismissing your legitimate claims, universal prosecutors were building airtight cases against every individual who had participated in your persecution. While corrupt judges were looking the other way, the supreme judge of the universe was preparing sentences that would make earthly prison terms seem like brief inconveniences. You started noticing that those who had wronged you were beginning to experience mysterious setbacks in their personal lives. The corrupt officer who had ignored your calls suddenly found personal relationships crumbling without explanation. The prosecutor who had dismissed your case began having nightmares that disrupted sleep and affected job performance. The judge who had refused to grant your restraining order started experiencing anxiety attacks that medical professionals couldn't diagnose or treat. But your divine protection wasn't just about spiritual consequences. It was actively working through physical reality to ensure justice would be served. Evidence that should have been destroyed was being secretly copied and preserved by individuals who suddenly developed consciences after witnessing too much corruption. Witnesses who should have been intimidated into silence were finding unexpected courage to speak truth. Communications that should have remained confidential were being leaked by sources who couldn't explain why conscience was compelling them to act. Your guardian angels were positioning human allies in strategic locations throughout the system. Honest journalists were being guided to investigate your case. Ethical lawyers were being inspired to take on corrupt institutions pro bono. Federal investigators were receiving anonymous tips that pointed them directly toward the evidence needed to prosecute criminal conspiracy. Every prayer you whispered in desperation was being answered through miraculous interventions that corrupt forces couldn't understand or counter. The damage inflicted was returning tenfold, with compound interest accumulated over extended periods of systematic abuse. Now corrupt officials were the ones living in fear, not because of what you might do to them directly, but because of what had been done to themselves through criminal choices. Corruption had finally caught up with them, and absolutely no escape existed from consequences that had been earned. Your ultimate vindication was still approaching like a tsunami of divine justice that would sweep away every trace of corruption that had dared to target your innocent soul. Federal indictments were being prepared with evidence so overwhelming that even corrupt lawyers couldn't find loopholes. Bank accounts were being frozen as financial crimes were uncovered. Pension funds were being seized as criminal enterprises were exposed. Personal assets were being forfeited as racketeering charges were filed. The corrupt officer who had laughed at your suffering was about to discover that criminal conspiracy carries mandatory minimum sentences. The prosecutor who had buried your case was about to learn that obstruction of justice results in disbarment and imprisonment. The judge who had protected your abuser was about to face impeachment proceedings that would destroy reputation and legacy forever. You weren't supposed to survive the coordinated assault, but you did more than survive. You became the catalyst for complete exposure and destruction of entire corrupt networks. Your divine protection had been documenting every crime, preserving every piece of evidence, and building cases that would result in justice being served in ways that exceeded your wildest dreams. Prison sentences were approaching that would ensure those who had failed would spend the remainder of their lives contemplating the consequences of targeting a chosen one. Asset forfeiture proceedings were being initiated that would leave corrupt families homeless and destitute. Professional licenses were being revoked that would ensure criminal participants could never again hold positions of public trust. The system may have failed you initially, but truth cannot be buried forever beneath lies and corruption. Systematic abuse that tried to silence your voice is now unraveling before the eyes of the world. Your perseverance forced the truth into the blinding light of public scrutiny. What was dismissed as complaints of a victim became the battle cry of a warrior who had exposed the fundamental reality of systems designed to protect themselves rather than people meant to be served. This isn't merely your individual story of triumph over corruption. This is a demonstration of divine power that flows through awakened souls like you. Every chosen one who has ever been targeted by corrupt systems carries within them the same unstoppable force that brought these criminals to justice. The evidence was irrefutable from the very beginning, just as it was when this story started. But now, instead of being buried beneath lies and corruption, that evidence has become the foundation for criminal prosecutions that will result in decades of imprisonment for those who dared to betray their sacred oaths. The officers who once nodded with false sympathy are facing federal charges that carry sentences longer than most people serve for violent crimes. The prosecutors who buried your case are about to discover that civil rights violations are prosecuted with the full weight of federal law. The judges who protected corruption are confronting impeachment proceedings that will destroy everything built through careers of criminal behavior. Chosen one. Corrupt forces failed to protect you when protection was your right, but answers have come for every moment of that failure, in ways that exceed earthly justice. Your divine protection ensured not just that truth would eventually surface, but that every individual who participated in your persecution would face consequences that perfectly matched the severity of their crimes against your innocent soul. The reckoning has been completed, and corruption could not survive the light of truth you forced upon it. You are not victims, you are warriors of divine justice, whose victory proves that no corrupt system can stand against awakened power that flows through your very existence. The universe tested you through fire, and you emerged transformed into an unstoppable force for justice that will ensure no other innocent soul suffers what you endured. This is your victory, chosen ones, and it echoes through eternity as proof that divine protection is real, spiritual justice is inevitable, and those who target awakened souls will face consequences that transcend human understanding.